people in the crowd are sitting beside you and got to know each other on a more personal basis. We're now going to move in from the legal discussion on how to bring atrocities to the political one. Talk about the concept known as the Responsibility to Protect, which is known as R2P in short, which is perhaps becoming the most heated and debated concepts in international affairs in the past few years. And I can think of no one better to actually talk about the subject than someone that works at the Global Center for R2P, a center that I had the great fortunate luck as my first month of joining MIGS in 2008. I was invited to actually attend the unveiling and opening of the launch of the center in 2008 at the UN headquarters. So I'd like to actually to introduce our guest speaker, a good friend of MIGS. I would call upon Natalie to actually come and read her bio.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. So it's a pleasure to introduce Naomi Kikoler this afternoon. I recently just met her, and she's great. So Naomi Kikoler is the Director of Policy and Advocacy of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. She is currently a lecturer at the New School University and teaches a course on international human rights, advocacy, and responsibility to protect. Naomi is the author of numerous publications, including the 2011 report titled Risk Factors and Legal Norms Associated with Genocide Prevention for the United Nations Office on the Prevention of Genocide and the Jacob Blaustein Institute. Prior to joining the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect in 2008, she worked on national security and refugee law and policy for Amnesty International Canada. Naomi holds common law and civil law degrees from McGill University, a Master's of Science in Forced Migration from Oxford University, where her thesis was on the Rwandan genocide, and a BA from the University of Toronto in International Relations and Peace and Conflict Studies. Please help me in welcoming Naomi Kikoler.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start by standing here. Bear with me, I'm a little bit under the weather, so I might be sniffling as we go along, but hopefully that's your fellow. I'm going to talk to you about the responsibility to protect, and as Kyle mentioned, it's a rather controversial topic in some sectors. And in the interest of kind of giving you a bit of a background about what R2P is and the debate, I'm going to do it a little bit as a kind of lecture to begin with, and then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. Otherwise, I suspect that within the first 5 minutes, we'll have tons of questions and we won't get anywhere, or at least that's been my experience thus far. So I just want to start by saying thank you very much to MIGS for the invitation. We worked very closely with Kyle and your team, and really value a lot of the work that MIGS is doing. It's really quite an important project, especially here in Canada, to try to move forward this particular agenda. And I'll talk a little bit about Canada's unique role in the kind of development and genesis of R2P as we go along. I'd like to say also that it's a real personal honor to be here. As was mentioned before, Professor Provost was one of my professors. I wasn't a very good student of his, but he actually was kind enough to send me to Rwanda on a fellowship, which helped to kind of really build my interest in this particular subject. It's also a real honor to be here because, especially for those of you who are not Canadian or not from Montreal, Montreal is a very kind of unique place in Canada's history in terms of this particular issue. Montreal and Halifax is where most of Canada's refugees came to Canada. It's where my own family came on the first boat of Jews that were allowed into Canada after the end of the Holocaust, and my maternal grandparents survived Auschwitz. So this is a very important city in the conversation about what are we trying to do as an international community to try to prevent mass atrocities. As many of you know, and I know there are people here from Canada's Border Services Agency, many countries around the world closed their borders to refugees, just as many countries around the world close their borders today to Rohingya refugees in Burma. Unfortunately, now people are closing their borders to Syrian refugees as well. So, you know, it's a very timely conversation and a really kind of important location to have this established in 2008. And we were created with the mandate to try to move forward the emerging norm of the responsibility to protect. The Center does that through a combination of different activities. We undertake research and analysis to help build the conceptual understanding of what R2P is. We also do direct advocacy, primarily targeting Security Council members and key governments, including 30 governments that form something called the New York-based Group of Friends of R2P, to try to encourage them to take action, not just on individual country situations, but on changing their kind of architectures of prevention that exist both at the national, regional, and international level. We also work privately behind the scenes to try to help states and regional organizations build up their capacity to prevent. And as we sit here right now, there is a meeting that's taking place in Ghana where 30 countries from around the world are meeting to discuss what they can do in a domestic capacity to try to advance the mass atrocity prevention and R2P agenda. So that's just the background on the center. I provided you all with a little bit of information so that you can see the type of work we do. We put out every 2 months an R2P monitor that highlights situations that we think are of concern to the responsibility to protect. If you're interested in having this sent to you, you can just sign up. We do research on lessons learned and best practices. Some of you have papers on Libya, some on Burundi. Currently are doing research right now on Kenya as a case study of prevention and success. We also monitor very closely what governments say, and I'll talk about that as we move forward. So in terms of the responsibility to protect, first of all, how many of you are familiar with R2P? Great. Okay, so that's perfect. We've got a good basis from there to work with. The responsibility to protect is essentially, as Professor Prevost said, a political framework for trying to make the commitment to never again, real. It was agreed to in 2005 at the UN World Summit, where all heads of states unanimously committed to protect, one, their populations from 4 crimes: war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. They also agreed to support and help states in fulfilling that responsibility to protect. And then the part of the responsibility to protect that gets the most attention is that states also agreed that the international community has a responsibility to protect populations from mass atrocities when their governments are unable or unwilling to protect them. So either that means their governments are perpetrating crimes, or their governments are unable to stop the perpetration of crimes by non-state actors against populations within their borders. So R2P very simply consists of 3 pillars that I mentioned: state responsibility, international assistance, and the 3rd pillar is international responsibility to act in a timely and decisive way to protect populations. It also involves only 4 crimes, so we're not talking about climate change, HIV/AIDS, the Arctic shield melting. All of these things are very, very important, but that's not what R2P is about. There's a couple of other things that R2P is not about, and I want to just kind of address them right at the outset to help frame our conversation. I should start the timer too. This is what I do in my lectures for school, and it doesn't work well. Thank you. Okay, so very quickly, at the core, the responsibility to protect is a commitment to prevention. Prevention is what the responsibility to protect in its most earnest form is all about. The more that we can do to engage at an early stage to avert mass atrocities, the less the likelihood is that we're going to need to resort to the use of force or other coercive measures that we all know are both more costly and require considerably more political will to actually to mount that type of, to sort of mobilize the political will to be able to act. R2P is not about regime change. It's important to underscore that because that's been one of the big critiques in recent years after the intervention in Libya. The responsibility to protect cares about the manner in which regimes carry out their responsibilities, but it is not meant to be a guise or used as a means to undermine governments or to change the existing regime. If a government is committing mass atrocity crimes, though, understandably one can understand that there are times where it's simply, I'm sorry, this is where my cold kicks in. It's simply, it's hard to imagine that you could have, for example, a Habyarimana regime, which perpetrated the genocide in Rwanda, remaining in power. We have seen certain instances where, for example, Milosevic stayed in power after the end of the war in the former Yugoslavia, but there was a transition that took place. So there are times where one can see that it's simply incomprehensible to imagine that a regime would remain in power after it has perpetrated mass atrocity crimes. R2P is also not strictly about military intervention. If anything, military intervention is the aspect of R2P that we speak least about. We don't live in a world where we see too much military intervention, where we see the international community engaging on a regular basis to try to protect population. Our problem has actually been the exact opposite, that we don't see engagement in any manner, usually in many mass atrocity situations. So to talk about R2P as being strictly about military intervention is to misrepresent what the norm is actually about. Finally, it's also not a tool that's meant to kind of do democracy promotion. Many of the cases that we work on are situations where there is an election that is coming, and there appears to be a risk of potential mass atrocity crimes that will be perpetrated during the election period. So we monitor those situations very carefully. But we're not monitoring them because we care about what the outcome of the election is. We're monitoring them because we think there's a risk of potential mass atrocities associated during that time period. So therefore, in a situation like Côte d'Ivoire, where certain governments asserted that R2P was invoked to try to determine which political candidate actually won the election, that's simply not the case. What we're there to do is to ensure that all parties in elections act in a responsible manner, do not use hate speech, do not use their supporters to perpetrate crimes on opponents and things of the such. So that's a very brief kind of overview of what R2P is. In terms of what was the problem that it was meant to solve, I think all of you are very familiar with that. And I think that Professor Provost's invocation of the quote by Hitler kind of says it all. No one remembers the Armenians. The Response to Protect was created to try to find a way for states to be able to overcome the impediments to acting to save lives that existed in the wake of the Kosovo intervention, where there was a considerable debate about the legal legitimacy of that action, yet at the same time, most governments were in agreement that there was moral legitimacy to act. So Kofi Annan then asked the world, if we're unable to intervene to save lives, if the notion of state sovereignty is so solid that we have to stand by as mass atrocities are being perpetrated, how then do we prevent a future Rwanda? And in response to that, a number of initiatives were launched. One, which doesn't get a lot of attention, happened within the African Union. The African Union in 2000 incorporated into its AU Constitutive Act something called Article 4H. Article 4H actually is a little bit more explicit than R2P because it actually says that there is a right to intervene in situations of mass atrocities. And that is something that every single African state endorsed through their Constitutive Act and are now, with varying degrees, implementing it through creating the African Peace and Security Apparatus or architecture. The other initiative that we're going to talk about was the creation of this kind of concept or emerging norm of the Response to Protect. When Kofi Annan made this plea to the international community in 1999, one government decided to do something about it, and that government was the Canadian government. The Canadian government in 2000 established the International Commission on State Sovereignty and Intervention. And the report that they created, the ISIS report, is essentially the kind of, not to use religious terms, but the kind of Bible of R2P. It helped lay out the early iterations of what R2P would be. It was building on work that had been done by others already, including Francis Deng and Roberta Cohen, who had worked on the issue of internal displacement, and who had reframed sovereignty already as sovereignty as responsibility. To be a sovereign government meant you had to uphold your international human rights obligations. There were certain norms and values that you needed to embrace in order to be a responsible sovereign government and sovereign power. If you were not going to be upholding those responsibilities, then the international community then had a responsibility to respond. And building on those developments, the ISIS report was released. And to kind of fast forward a little bit, the findings of the ISIS report were incorporated into what became the Secretary General's high-level panel on international threats. I got the name wrong. But essentially, the provisions made its way, in part through the shepherding of the Canadian government at the time, into the 2005 World Summit. And at the UN World Summit in 2005, there were a number of different issues that were being discussed. And I think Professor Provost mentioned that of them, I think it was Senator Laird, of them, R2P remains one of the most lasting contributions of this kind of momentous meeting of heads of states. And at that particular time, there's a couple of things that are important to just highlight, because it's important to recall that R2P, as we see it today, was actually born very much out of political compromise. At the 2005 World Summit, you saw a very strong leadership role played by the Canadian government, by both the then Prime Minister and also by the then Foreign Minister. And when I say a personal role, I mean literally picking up the phone to call other heads of states to say, this is really important. There's a lot of things you're negotiating right now, but if you want to see the world be able to actually actualize never again, you need to incorporate these provisions into the World Summit. And I say that's important because I think today one of the challenges we face in moving R2P forward is that we lack that kind of international champion. We lack the Canada of today to help move the R2P agenda forward. So in 2005, personal champions were critical in securing the support for R2P, which, for those who haven't seen the actual text, R2P is captured within paragraphs 138 and 139 of the World Summit Outcome Agreement, Outcome Document. I recommend you all look at it. I think it's actually in some of our documents as well. But it was also, as I said, very much a kind of negotiated definition of what R2P would be. R2P, in the early iterations in the documents, were slightly more broad. It wasn't defined as kind of 4 crimes. The lawyers got in and thought, let's make it more precise. Let's try to limit, perhaps, the types of cases that we mean when we invoke the responsibility to protect. So let's use the language of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, to limit the applicability of R2P cases and protect ourselves from R2P ever being invoked in our own country situation. One of the things lawyers didn't kind of take into account was, well, war crimes can be single acts. You can commit a war crime against one person or even against a structure. Crimes against humanity remain kind of an evolving set of legal norms. And it's at times unclear what could be potentially a crime against humanity, what isn't. Ethnic cleansing, while included within the International Criminal Tribunals, doesn't exactly have its own freestanding legal definition. So even amongst the legal community now, the attempt to try to find a compromise to limit and narrow down R2P as captured in the World Summit Outcome Document has actually created a whole set of new questions about when does R2P apply, what are the triggers like, how do we decide if use of force, for example, is required. But it was a compromise, and that's how we ended up with the four crimes included within that. The development of R2P in 2005 was also a compromise because there was a big debate that was happening, and there were a number of countries that are incredibly outspoken in their opposition to R2P. For example, India led the charge, and with the backing of the non-aligned movement, argued that all R2P was essentially a new device through which Western powers could interfere in the affairs of smaller states. And therefore, why should they support a new norm that is essentially just going to be applied only to the South and only to certain specific states that did not have the backing and support of Western powers? And they're particularly vociferous in their opposition. And what was really interesting was to see that you saw countries like South Africa emerge and say to their non-aligned member counterparts, hang on, R2P was created to actually address the problems that we're facing within our own continent. It's been created as a means for us to be able to prioritize and strengthen African capacities to prevent, and it's been created as a means to allow us to get the support of the international community in doing so. They also argued in Article 4H, 5 years before the acceptance of R2P, the African states had already endorsed actually much firmer language. Remember, R2P doesn't create a right to intervene. It says that the international community has a responsibility to take timely and decisive action, and then there's a number of qualifiers. Those qualifiers include, when all diplomatic means and all necessary measures prove to have been exhausted, that type of language. The AU Constitutive Act is far more direct. So South Africa said, you've already agreed to this. And then, as I mentioned, you had Canada and a couple of other countries coming in and saying, this is an extremely important initiative. We need to find a way to find agreement. So what you saw was the language was played with and mishmashed and kind of made a little bit more acceptable to an array of states so they could get, at that time, all 192 countries on board. At the time, countries like Russia and China weren't actually very active and involved in the debate. There were many other countries that were leading the charge against R2P, including countries like Algeria, Egypt, I mentioned to you already India. There were Caribbean countries that were also opposed to R2P. And you know, it was quite interesting because what we've seen over the years is many of those countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua, Honduras have continued to express concerns about R2P, but many of the others have begun to and increasingly abandon their concerns and reservations about what it's about, and we'll continue to that just in a couple of minutes. So once we got the agreement to kind of advance the responsibility to protect, between the period of 2008 and 2009, 2005 and 2009, there was very little discussion about it. There was no international debates or forums for those debates to happen. We saw R2P type language invoked during the Iraq War. Many people argued then that R2P had been given a bad name and said that the Iraq War was proof that R2P really was just kind of humanitarian intervention and in new clothing. In 2009, R2P got a little bit of a moment of kind of rebirth, because that was the first time where the UN Secretary General actually released a report on the responsibility to protect. And since that time, every year we've had a report on the responsibility to protect, and every year we've had a UN dialogue within the General Assembly, where states can go on the record outlining their support for or concerns about the responsibility to protect. And through those successive Secretary General reports, we've actually seen a refinement of what the responsibility to protect means. So it's a really kind of interesting exercise to read those reports, and with each one it builds on how we regard R2P and what it means for states, regional organizations, and the UN to actually uphold that responsibility to protect. But we also began to see the language of R2P being included in discussions about country situations. It started in a kind of very difficult manner with the Sri Lanka crisis. And if many of you recall, between January and May of 2009, there was an offensive in northeastern Sri Lanka between the Sri Lankan government and the LTT, the Tamil Tigers, in which over 200,000 people were trapped within an area of land that's kind of no bigger than Central Park. And essentially both sides were holding the public, to a certain degree, that was trapped there, captive. And ostensibly, that little space of land was called a no-fire zone. The no-fire zone essentially became the fire zone. And that was one of the first examples where primarily civil society began to try to use the language of responsibility to protect to encourage the international community to do more to protect civilians that were trapped between an organization that was regarded as a terrorist organization and between the Sri Lankan government that at one point labeled everyone trapped within that area as LTT cadre and essentially said that they were fair game. And it was a bit of a challenging foray to try and apply the responsibility to protect to a particular situation. And I think in history, Sri Lanka will probably go down as one of the international community's glaring examples of failure. A failure to act through the Security Council, but also a failure for individual governments to do all that they could within their power to try to prevent mass atrocity crimes. And I say that because within the Security Council at the time, and I was doing advocacy lobbying council members at that period, the paradigm through which governments saw what was happening in Sri Lanka was strictly one of fighting a war on terror. And I think in those particular cases, it's really important for the lens of the responsibility to protect, for the lens of preventing mass atrocity crimes to be inserted into those cases where there is a gray zone. I say that because the attitude of many of the council members that I engaged with at the time was, when you fight a war on terror, certain crimes were willing to essentially look the other way. War crimes, essentially, even though legally unacceptable, are politically permissible at times during that particular environment. I had, for example, Western governments say, we just hope they get it over with quickly. And I say, well, if you realize that thousands of people are dying, they don't have access to medical care, there's no clean water, there's no food, and they're being shot at by the LTT, and then also bombed indiscriminately by the government forces. We just have to get it over with quickly. We know there's war crimes that are happening, but they need to carry out this war. I had one of the P2 members of Russia and China, when we mentioned that 7,000 people at that time had been killed, say, what is 7,000 people? And I said, well, you know, in the case of the former Yugoslavian Srebrenica, 8,000 was regarded genocide. I said, but we shouldn't have to get into the name game. This is 2009, after we've said never again for over 50 years, and you've got diplomats saying, thousands of people dead. Why does that matter? I think that's one of the reasons why R2P actually is so critical, because we need to change the frame through which governments understand crisis situations and change the tools that they think that they have available to them to try to dissuade perpetrators from perpetrating these particular crimes. In the case of Sri Lanka, it's not just member states who didn't do enough to uphold the responsibility to protect. And when I say didn't do enough, actively tried to prevent the issue from being discussed within the UN Security Council. For those of you who don't know, Sri Lanka, it took months for the Security Council to even hold formal briefings, and they never actually held a formal briefing. They created an innovative tool called an informal briefing, which was essentially held in the basement of the Security Council, off the record, so there's no formal account. There will be no archive that these meetings even happened to discuss Sri Lanka because it was too sensitive. And this was a country where arguably the strategic interests of the great powers were not significant. But the Sri Lankan government had followed the playbook that I think mass atrocity perpetrators do a very good job of following. Has been replicated by Assad, was replicated by Gbagbo and Cote d'Ivoire. They essentially made it almost impossible for independent observers, for the media, for the UN, for human rights and humanitarian organizations to get into the no-fire zone. They sealed off that area so that there was almost no information that could come out. They also made it, they put a lot of pressure through sending their foreign minister and diplomats around the world to lobby Security Council members. So if you did a little bit of a map and looked at the travels of the foreign minister and his kind of elite team during the period of that offensive, you will see that they went to Mexico City, they went to Tripoli, they went to Paris, they went to the UK, they went all over the world to meet with Security Council members, both permanent and elected at that time, to say, you two have fought a war on terror. You two understand what we're doing. Do not put us on the Security Council agenda. This is not a mass atrocity situation. They did a business deal with Libya, hundreds of millions of dollars, and agreement to allow, I believe it was Libyan jobs in Sri Lanka. In Mexico, they talked about Chiapas and fighting the terrorists in Chiapas. In Ankara, they talked about the PKK. In France, they talked about the fight against Algeria. Their rhetoric was extremely compelling, and they had a very, very deft diplomatic corps. And as a result, the Security Council failed to uphold its responsibility to protect. And only now, years later, do many Security Council members acknowledge that. Only in the aftermath, when it became clear that tens of thousands of people were killed in this no-fire zone, which the government razed to the ground 3 days after the fighting ended, did member states realize that they should have done more? Did Western governments realize that they should have pushed the agenda onto the Security Council and should have tried to get a resolution and should have tried to push the other states, even if it meant getting a veto? It was a failing, and it shows again why the responsibility to protect is so relevant. Relevant not just because of the Kosovos and the Rwandas, it's relevant because of the cases like Sri Lanka, and because of the cases that aren't today getting enough attention. The South Kordofans and Blue Niles, the Rohingya, the situation in Syria to Greece. The situation in Sri Lanka, though, also is an illustrated case of what more the UN as an institution can do. And thankfully, the UN has, in the past year, released a report which outlines what some of its failings were. But just to give you an example, and I highlight these examples because when we talk about the responsibility to protect, we're not suggesting that states need to take and develop these kind of new onerous institutions that will be costly. What we're essentially saying is that existing tools that we have, existing infrastructure that we have are being underutilized. It's not that governments need necessarily more information. You have at your disposal, in many cases, a lot of information. It's about how you analyze that information, how you understand it, but then most importantly, how you move that up the chain within the kind of political apparatus to ensure that states actually act on that early warning information. And that you understand the array of tools that are involved.
Just one quick point of information. The UN staff members go once the Sri Lankan government
Yes.
pushed them to go.
Yeah.
It's a very important thing to remember. That happened in September 2008 before
Yeah.
final offenses started in January 2009. The UN acquiesced to that, did not fight it.
Yes.
So that's something
Yes.
that should be mentioned.
Yes, so just very quickly on that, and I'll just tie it into kind of what the UN, some of the failings were there, and why, again, it's so important for not just governments, but regional and international organizations to internalize the frame of looking at situations from a mass atrocity prevention and an RGP prevention perspective, because it's relevant to the work of human rights and protection officers within the UN system. It's relevant to the work of humanitarian agencies that are also here in this room. But on the end of the UN, as was mentioned, all UN staff, essentially kind of international staff, left the kind of area that ended up becoming the no-fire zone in September of 2008. There were some remaining local staff that stayed within that particular area, and also for a couple of relief organizations or the religious denomination, which I will kind of go into, that did play a very important role in getting what little information was able to get out. But I think the argument about the kind of UN acquiescence is not just the fact that the UN had agreed to the departure of its staff from this particular area, but I think it's a very difficult, and it will remain a difficult conversation for the UN, but the frame through which many of the UN officials and senior officials looked at the situation in Sri Lanka was one of how to maintain access. Access to provide very much needed humanitarian assistance to those who had been displaced. And there were over 200,000 people that had been displaced. But in the interest of maintaining access, in an environment where certain UN officials had already been, there had been a history of UN officials being essentially kicked out of the country, in an environment where the UN's calculation was, we're going to play an important role in post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation of the country, they did not push very hard on raising the human rights dimensions of the crisis in Sri Lanka. It's now made public. At the time, they sat on a statement by the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide for weeks, where he outlined that he believed that the situation had clear ethnic undertones, that mass atrocities were at risk and happening. It was the only statement from a UN official that framed what was happening in Sri Lanka from an R2P perspective, and they refused to release it. They released it only at the end, only under pressure from our organization and others because we were aware of it, and only because at the end they finally realized and were willing to speak publicly about the fact that mass atrocities were actually happening. To give you an example of some of the underutilized tools that the UN had at their disposal and did not use at that time, during the Gaza conflict that happened in December of 2008, so 1 month before this kind of big offensive in Sri Lanka began, the United Nations released on a regular basis satellite imagery that showed the impact of Israeli bombings within Gaza on the local infrastructure. They released regularly death tolls, which they acknowledged were difficult to verify, but they released those on a regular basis. In Sri Lanka, much of the work that I was doing was to say to the UN, you are sitting on satellite images. You are sitting on numbers. What is the difference between the people in Sri Lanka and the people in Gaza? As the United Nations, you should be taking a principled position. You should be using every measure in your disposal to try to uphold the responsibility to protect. Yet they failed to do so. And I say that again just to remind you that we're not talking about, in many cases, things that are new and revolutionary. What we're talking about is if you're going to uphold the responsibility to protect, it's incumbent on you to understand what tools do you already have at your disposal and how can you better use them to try to prevent future mass atrocities. If you work in foreign affairs on economic sanctions pertaining to terrorists, how can those same sanctions and these kind of great new innovative financial tools be used to try to dissuade potential perpetrators of mass atrocities? If you work for the Border Services Agency, in the case of Sri Lanka, the commander of the army wanted to go to visit the United States. He had children, as did many of the senior Sri Lankan officials that were going, had children that were going to university in the United States. You can look at the ways in which you permit access to your country to people who are suspected war criminals, who are perpetrating mass atrocities. I know it's extremely political, but we've got international standards that you can use to kind of assist you in that particular case. You can look at interesting potential targeted sanctions that may have implications for your children, or your assets, or your ability to go shopping, for example, in Paris, for those who are perpetrating crimes in Côte d'Ivoire. There are a lot of tools that are already available. We just need to think creatively about how we're using them and employ them to try to prevent mass atrocities. So I've used the kind of case of Sri Lanka, and I'll just kind of do a couple more minutes to show to you the types of challenges that we face in a kind of real-world example. Now, we've obviously seen R2P invoked in many other cases in Sri Lanka, and it was very contested. Most people did not want to use it, as I said, in that particular case. Only now, after the fact, are people willing to see it through that particular lens. But I raise it because it's one of those cases that's not talked about enough. There are other cases where we don't talk about R2P enough as well, and where it helps illustrate the type of cases that we're talking about when we talk about R2P actually being able to prevent mass atrocity crimes. The types of measures. Everyone wants to talk about a military intervention. As I said, if you're going to talk about military intervention, you're missing the point. Guinea, 2010, Guinea had experienced a coup the year before. There had been over 150 peaceful protesters that were shot, many women raped during a kind of protest, a demonstration of opposition supporters. There was a coup that took place in the country. There's a number of kind of variables that presented themselves and suggested that the country was at risk of potentially large-scale ethnic violence. In that particular case, there was, again, the Security Council was reluctant to put it on the formal agenda, but did find a way to talk about Guinea nonetheless. You had governments around the world who had no interest really in Guinea issue statements of concern. You had governments, including the Canadian government, send representatives from Dakar to Conakry to engage with both members of the coup leadership and from the opposition. You had the International Criminal Court say, and I should just give you the context, there was an agreement for there to be a transition from kind of military rule to a civilian government. And there was going to be elections that were held, and it appeared as though perhaps the coup leader would not respect the decision to have a civilian government take over. And you had the ICC, deputy prosecutor, go to Conakry and essentially say, we're watching this situation. If anything happens, individuals will be held accountable. We had targeted sanctions put on key individuals, key coup leaders, including the former Minister of Defense. That happened about kind of a year before. No military intervention, no actual ICC referral, very light in terms of types of coercive measures that was used, but a lot of intense engagement. Now, there are a couple of variables that make Guinea a little bit different. The situation in Guinea, in my opinion, was pulled back from the brink because of concerted diplomatic efforts at the local, regional, and international level. You had the UN working very closely with the AU on this particular effort. You had a couple of unique personalities, really key individuals who were championing this particular cause. It just so happened that the UN's West Africa Special Representative had previously worked for the AU. The AU's kind of mediator and envoy had worked for the UN. They spoke the same language. They understood, and when I say spoke the same language, understood the institutional languages. You had, unfortunately, the coup leader, the coup leader was shot in the head. So he was removed from the picture, but you still had a very, very volatile situation. And in that volatile mix, real sincere diplomatic engagement with a couple of kind of slightly firmer tools helped change the course of potentially history in the case of Guinea. We don't talk about Guinea. We don't talk about the fact that the threat of ICC referral actually worked. You had senior government officials in Conakry calling diplomats to say, hang on, what will that mean for my children and for my ability to travel if I'm targeted? You had the person who became kind of invested with the role of seeing the transition from military to civilian leadership. himself subjected to targeted sanctions, very much wanting to get off the list of those who had faced targeted sanctions, therefore being very constructive. And because he was a former Minister of Defense, able to go into the barracks and say to the military, do not perpetrate crime, do not instigate violence. It's a unique case, but it shows how there are actually lots of different ways in which we could potentially prevent mass atrocity crimes, and in situations that are not the kind of usual cases that we're always talking about. So where are we in terms of R2P today? I talked about some different cases, give you some of the challenges that we're facing. We're in an environment where we see still a lot of rhetorical support. Professor Provost said no one wants to say that they support the Commission of Mass Atrocity Crimes. Everyone wants to say that they support Never Again. What they're actually doing to make that real, though, varies very much based on the country or the regional organization or even the UN department, if we want to look at all different layers. We are seeing the institutionalization of the responsibility to protect. As I mentioned, right now, there's 30 governments meeting in Ghana to talk about what they can do at the national level. We see governments appointing senior government officials as focal points with the purpose of mainstreaming R2P within their own governments. One of the first things focal points are doing is bringing together relevant agencies and departments to talk about what are their existing capacities to prevent. What more can they be doing? You have them also coming together to talk about developing training programs so that new diplomats, for example, every new diplomat going to the Foreign Service in Argentina receives a briefing from a gentleman who was on the Security Council when Argentina was there in 1994 and involved in the deliberations in Rwanda. He talks to them about genocide. He talks to them about what it means to be a responsible international diplomat in a situation where mass atrocities are being perpetrated. The Ministry of Defense in Argentina receives training on the responsibility to protect and mass atrocity prevention. So too do many others around the world who are taking this kind of desire to hold R2P seriously. You also see countries like the United States creating an atrocity prevention board, where relevant agencies and departments are coming together, and again, trying to better understand how they can utilize existing mechanisms to try to uphold the responsibility to protect, to do some of the horizon scanning about what are potential future situations and what types of preventive responses they can take today. That model is beginning to be explored by other governments around the world. I think because it was mentioned by Senator Blair, it is worth highlighting that Canada played a very important role in 2005 and from 1999 to that period. It also was the co-chair of the Group of Friends based in New York. It remains a member of the Group of Friends today. But Canada, unfortunately, is not one of the countries that's sitting around the table today in Ghana. And it has not appointed a focal point, and it has not played a very strong kind of normative leadership role in recent years, which I think is a shame, especially given kind of who we are as a people and the values that we embrace, and also the background and the kind of intellectual knowledge and experience that we can bring to this particular issue. In terms of the kind of institutionalization, you're also seeing different regional organizations like ECOWAS undertake their own reviews about what they can do to operationalize R2P. It's primarily, that conversation's happening mostly at the kind of within Africa. You do see the EU creating kind of a task force on the responsibility to protect. There have been meetings with the OAS to talk about the responsibility to protect, but it's at a very, very nascent stage, as I said. We are seeing some improvements in the response aspect. I talked about how the Security Council refused to put Sri Lanka on its formal agenda. For a very long time, refused to seek briefings. We've seen actually some positive changes, especially over the last year. And I should just say that the constellation of Security Council members has changed in the last year as well. Today, out of 15 Security Council members, 10 are members of the New York-based Group of Friends, which means there are 10 countries that have all stated that R2P is a priority for them. So numerically, for any resolution, theoretically, they would be able to determine the outcome, because you need 9 states to vote in favor of a resolution for it to be passed. But it also means that they can do creative and interesting new things to try to bring to the Council's agenda, to the Council's attention, early warning information about the potential for mass atrocities. And one situation where that was done recently, and which I think is worth just highlighting, prior to the March 2013 elections in Kenya, there was a lot of concern about the potential for a recurrence of violence during the electoral period. And in that particular case, the United Kingdom made a request for a briefing from the Department of Political Affairs to get the Department of Political Affairs analysis on whether or not they thought that there was a risk of potential violence in Kenya. They asked for it under something called any other business. It sounds very dry, very procedural, kind of a common sense, sure, why wouldn't they ask for information about something that so clearly potentially was a risk? But in many ways, it's actually pretty darn revolutionary. So I just have that to say that, while there might be a lot of pessimism about the future of R2P, while we might say that, sure, there's a lot of rhetorical support, but very little action, there is actually a lot of little things that are happening that when you put them together, actually translate into something pretty remarkable, both at the domestic level, regional, and international level. We're seeing a change in the way governments understand what their responsibilities should be. And I would say even in the case of Canada, we may not be a norm champion anymore of the responsibility to protect, but our actions in many ways, without a doubt, convey that we very much support these principles. We've tried to find every possible means in which to engage and try to prevent and deter mass atrocities, for example, in Syria. We've continued to look at ways to be innovative and try to assist in the situation in Sudan. So because governments do not necessarily use the language of R2P to explain their actions, I believe that their actions do show a deep and sincere kind of embracing of the values that are captured within the responsibility to protect. And in many ways, that is probably far more important. My hope is that they'll continue to champion the actual norm, and that it's very important to have middle power and soft power countries use the language of R2P, because they need to be the ones to kind of bridge the conversation between northern and southern states that are supportive of R2P or not. It doesn't, the north-south thing doesn't necessarily correspond with supportive or not supportive. I think we've also seen, though, in terms of where R2P is, and I'll stop in a couple of minutes, that there obviously is still opposition. There are many countries who continue to think R2P is just about regime change. But it is worth noting that those same countries that express a lot of concern about R2P, like, for example, South Africa in the wake of the intervention in Libya, behind the scenes still organize meetings of member states to talk about R2P, still are willing to come to the table and engage in a dialogue about what it means. They're still sending, for example, troops to participate in the intervention brigade in the DRC. So there's a lot of rhetoric out there, and there's a lot of bluster, but at the end of the day, I think we're actually seeing a positive shift in many, many countries' behavior on this particular issue. I think we also recognize, though, that actualizing R2P, upholding R2P is not easy. We can all look at the case of Syria right now and say that it proves that R2P fails. And I know that this is not going to bring solace to anyone who currently is in Syria and facing the risk of mass atrocity crimes. But if you look at the action that has been taken today by governments around the world to try to prevent more mass atrocities in Syria, it's not enough, but it is quite a lot at the end of the day. When you see governments thinking about how to use sanction regimes, when you see governments ending kind of economic ties, when you see governments closing their embassies, when you see governments trying to push resolutions through the Security Council, through the Human Rights Council, when you see governments supporting cross-border humanitarian assistance, when you see governments openly condemning on a regular basis what's happening there. Again, it's not enough, but if you go back, as I've done, to look at what governments did in 1994, what governments did and what they said in public forums and international forums during the situation in East Timor, Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, it is a dramatic change in the way governments understand what their responsibilities are. Today, last year, the opening of General Assembly, and again, this is just rhetorical, but there is some significance in it. You had around 130 countries invoke the situation in Syria and express concern about it in their statements at the opening of the General Assembly. If you go back and look at those same statements that were made in 1994 and during the period of the war in the former Yugoslavia, we got like 20 countries talking about Rwanda. After, when there was large displacement, you had many more talk about it. But in terms of talking about these crises, expressing concern about these crises, you didn't have that 20 years ago. You didn't have states trying to think about what types of measures they could put in place. And again, it means little because, unfortunately, many people are facing a constant barrage of bombs and being shot at, all these various horrific things today in Syria. But it is significant to say that there has been a change in the behavior of states, not just in their rhetoric. I'm going to kind of leave it there, open it up to questions, and yeah.
Don't be shy.
I managed to silence everyone. Yes.
Naomi, thank you first for your presentation.
If I could just ask if everyone could just introduce themselves.
Sure, Colette Massichelli from Center for Global Affairs in London. If I recall, you were in Kenya?
Yes. I was in Kenya in December, then for the elections for the Carter Center, and then I was back in Kenya 3 weeks ago.
Okay. Given those different visits, how would you assess from what we saw happening tragically 2007, 2008 to now, the impact of what was done on the ground by locals using different technologies, using community leadership to try to keep attention on the elections? How would you assess the progress or lack thereof that's been made from 7-8 to now in terms of keeping the focus on trying to prevent violence around elections?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that gets missed in the analysis around 2007, 2008 was how important local civil society was in bringing in the violence and also helping to move the country forward in that kind of immediate aftermath period. We think of 07 and 08 so much as Kofi Annan's mediation, which that was kind of essential to bringing an end to the violence, but it was supported very much by the fact that there were local peacemakers that were taking his message out to various communities, that you had the media on board trying to serve as responsible stakeholders after having played a not as positive role. Between 07 and 08 and the most recent elections, I think that there have been a lot of really good positive innovations that have taken place in that space. And I think you've seen it happen when it comes to technology. You've seen really remarkable kind of early warning platforms that were first experimented with during that election. The most famous was Ushahidi, but there are many other platforms that exist. You see online space being created to actually bring young people together and have a dialogue about what the future of Kenya should look like. You see new stakeholders joining the conversation. Lee had been talking before about the role of business. It was actually quite important in this most recent election that the very important business community within Kenya spoke out and said we cannot afford to have violence. Bear in mind that violence in Kenya affects not just Kenya. Essentially, the shutting down of the major road between Mombasa and Kampala, created serious problems for Uganda, for Kenya. Anything that would happen in Kenya would also affect South Sudan and the international efforts in Somalia. So, there were many stakeholders that were involved, a diversity of stakeholders, I'd say, in the most recent 2013 election that perhaps hadn't been there before, in part because of the work of local domestic actors in trying to reach out to and identify who these kind of voices could be. You saw an array, you see Kenyan Kenyan Olympic athletes going to the Tana River where there had been intercommunal violence and trying to say to people, we're all one, we're all Kenyan. A lot of people will argue, and I think that there's a very good reason to do so, that one of the major contributing factors to there being no violence with this most previous election was the political marriage of convenience between Kenyatta and Ruto, who essentially came together to try to evade ICC prosecution. And then in the merger of Kenyatta and Ruto, the tensions that sometimes exist between their two ethnic groups, the Kalenjin and the Kikuyu, dissipated dramatically. So it's difficult to be able to kind of say what percentage or the importance of either thing. I think that the efforts of local civil society, the fact that there were peace committees, the fact that there was a peace agreement, for example, in Nakuru, where there's historically been violence in all of the previous kind of multi-party elections. And for that peace agreement, it was elders within the various ethnic groups that came and sat around the table with the support of local civil society to say, we will not allow our young people to be mobilized to commit crime. Keep in mind, we're talking like literally, people being paid $2 to pick up machetes or take to the streets and cause violence. people are paid to essentially perpetrate crimes in informal settlements in the kind of slum areas of Nairobi, Kisumu, and Nakuru. And with the help of civil society, they were able to talk to community elders to encourage them to try to encourage their young people to not do that. Lots of challenges exist, throughout much of East Africa and much of the world. Traditional structures are eroding in terms of kind of the value and importance of elders. But in this particular case, I think it was useful. I don't know if I answered your question, but it was. There's a lot of very innovative things that developed, and I think a lot of positive lessons. We've been working in Kenya, one, to try to encourage the Security Council to do what it did, but also because we've been working on a report that looks at the preventive, what types of lessons learned can we derive from the preventive efforts in Kenya between 2008 and 2013. And we'll release that report in October. It also looks very much at how the international community supported certain endeavors, including reforms to the judiciary and other aspects.
Andrew Kendall, I'm just wondering if your organization has, since its inception, has it done an examination sort of looking at overarching factors that were either positive or negative for particular situations that you got most actively involved with, and whether if you have produced any public documents along that line?
And outline what the kind of early warning signs are?
Where you did things right for your own organization, or what happened that went right in terms of a particular situation, and conversely, what went wrong in terms of your own advocacy or what was being advocated at the UN or elsewhere.
So we usually do try to do a lot of kind of self-reflection in the course of our work, and perhaps because I'm a lawyer, I'm very quantitative in what we do. So we try to track, for example, who we meet with, what are the points we raise. We also, at the same time, track when governments talk about the responsibility to track their voting records. We have this kind of matrix system which tries to help us identify and gauge levels of support from governments. In terms of our actual advocacy, most of our advocacy is directed, as I said, towards the Security Council when it comes to country situations. It doesn't necessarily go beyond. So yes, we can identify where, for example, we were able to get someone put on a sanctions list. So in that case, Côte d'Ivoire, one individual that was a broadcaster was put on a sanctions list. So we can do those types of things, but I don't want to overstate the role of our organization. We're not kind of in the thick of things we work much more on the structural side of trying to encourage governments to put in place things like national focal points, which was an initiative that we started with the governments of Denmark, Costa Rica, Ghana, and Australia. And for that type of structural work, there are lots of things where we can see successes. We do have a number of countries that are in the process of appointing focal points that are beginning to undertake reviews. I think the challenge there is, and it's the same challenge we have when we engage with council members, if a government has kind of 300 priorities, how do you ratchet this one up in the list of what they feel that they need to act on? And how do you explain why this is important? That remains kind of one of the biggest challenges that we have, because you have many governments who are very concerned that this is going to be costly and things along those lines.
Just one quick follow-up. The current members of the Security Council, what's your take on how they have moved in the last 5 years?
Oh, gosh.
I know that can take all day, right?
Okay. Permanent members of the Security Council, fascinating conversation. I work a lot with elected members, and therefore see a lot of the frustrations that elected members have in engaging with the P5. I think one of the big challenges facing those of us who are working to get this mass atrocity prevention and RGP agenda forward is that there has to be a real recognition that responding to mass atrocities and preventing mass atrocities requires a multilateral response, which means you need buy-in from states both north and south. You have to engage in dialogue. You have to talk about difficult issues. There has to be some level of respect in that particular conversation. And I think at times the P5, it doesn't matter who you're talking about, fail to manage the multilateral relationship in a way that's conducive to maintaining the multilateral partnership that is required to actually prevent mass atrocity crimes. The P5 and many other governments fail on many other management issues. I mean, around Libya, I think that many Western governments fail to manage the way in which they conveyed the challenges of actually undertaking NATO's mandate in Libya, what those challenges would be. You can't go to your public and say, it'll take 2 weeks or 3 weeks. We simply don't know. These situations are so fluid and so complex and so difficult that, you know, we have to be probably a little more frank, both with our publics, but also with other governments in talking about the challenges that exist in implementing some of these mandates when we talk about the use of force side. I think with the P5, you know, the most persistent kind of challenge is one of consistency and selectivity by all of them. I think the P3 generally, I think their voting record is one which shows support for the responsibility to protect. And I think that, you know, we tend to find the P2 still voting in a very predictable way on resolutions involving country situations. I think sometimes there is a simplistic argument made by advocates and the media about why they're voting a certain way. There's usually far more developed justifications for what they're doing, but they do still consistently vote in a way that obstructs action. So for example, in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, the Russians have been consistent in, up until recently, really being quite obstructionist in trying to get any action in that particular case. You know, it's difficult because there are very few principled governments when you talk about the responsibility to protect. Not everyone can be Guatemala or Denmark, essentially. Although I wish they would be. But also, you know, I think that the big challenges that people raise are around the use of the veto. And that's where some of my frustrations with the P3 come. There is an initiative by a number of governments to try to get a resolution passed through the General Assembly, which would essentially call for a voluntary restraint of the use of veto in mass atrocity situations. Seems like a pretty straightforward thing. If you look at the voting records of the P3, they have not been using the veto in mass atrocity situations, although some people will argue that in the case of votes by the US pertaining to Israel, they might make that argument. But in my reading of it, you don't see the P3 invoking the veto in mass atrocity situations. Yet, the use of the veto is the one thing that unites all P5 members. So the P3 were actually fairly active in trying to dissuade member states to support a broader resolution on human reform, and there are many issues there. But even in private conversation, there's still a reluctance to try to support this one endeavor. You know, there's a lot of small things that when it comes together create frustration. I think one of the biggest problems, as I said, is you need a multilateral response. Today, the world doesn't look the same that it did 10 years ago. So when you're going to negotiate resolutions within the Security Council, and I'm getting into the weeds here, you need to give people the resolution more than 24 hours or 48 hours in advance. You can't just expect that people will vote the way you want them to vote. And I have gone to Pretoria, Buenos Aires, capitals around the world of elected members to talk to them. And what's fascinating is how consistent their concerns are and their frustrations are with the way they were treated as elected members on the Security Council. And how they feel, we believe elected members have a very important role to play and can help bring a lot of these kind of RGB-related issues to the Council agenda, but how they feel that the process of being on the Security Council is actually one that disempowers rather than empowers them because of the way the P5 sometimes interacts with them.
Rwanda, you mentioned a couple of times, and myself as a Rohingya, I have lost almost all of my relatives and family members actually in killing. Now, it has become a burden to the neighboring countries, especially Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and Malaysia. The killing is multi-pronged. It's like prevention of blocking food, aids to the IDP camps, simple painkillers like medicine, and people who are not in IDP camps in the rural area, they cannot go out of the house. Bangladesh has completely sealed off the border, and people are dying in the ocean, Bay of Bengal, as well as people are dying in the police custody in Thailand, overcrowded. I was there actually a week ago. I just came back. And also I saw people dying in Malaysia, of course much less than dying in Thailand. Unfortunately, this international community seems very nonchalant about that, and I was wondering what significant step has taken by Turkey, as well as was there any plan to mobilize the international community to kind of intervene?
Such a difficult case, and I'm very sorry that your own family has been so intimately affected by this. It's, I think again it shows the challenge of consistency. One of the things that the center works on is trying to highlight and focus what we call neglected cases. And for us, the situation that the Rohingya has been a neglected case for now decades, essentially. Other cases that we looked on that were neglected and are neglected are, for example, South Kordofan and Blue Nile today in Sudan. And I think what's particularly concerning is that there's an immense amount of kind of excitement around the potential for a new semi-democratic government and what the reforms will look like. And one of the concerns that we had is that at the same time that countries are engaging and beginning to kind of strengthen economic ties, removing sanctions, there has to be an ongoing dialogue with the government about the situation facing the Rohingya, but also more recently kind of broader anti-Muslim violence that's affecting the country, which in part comes from this kind of emerging or burgeoning sense of kind of urban nationalism, which has potential risks not just for the Muslim community, but for other ethnic minorities within the country. And I think that, in 2008, when the issue came before the Security Council, in a kind of related manner, there was the use of the veto by the Russians and the Chinese, and it was supported at the time by the South African Security Council. And those governments tend to feel that there needs to be private engagement through ASEAN to try to influence the government. And I think, there is this sense that this kind of private engagement, quiet diplomacy may actually have some sort of a impact with the government. We have seen considerable reforms. But that doesn't mean anything for the Rohingya, because they continue to be denied citizenship. And if you listen to many of the government officials today, including people like Aung San Suu Kyi, who do not want to refer to them as Rohingya or as Burmese, they constantly refer to them as Bengali. And I think in cases like that, the Responsible Protect actually has a very important role to play. I think that we need to engage with governments in neighboring countries and say it's a matter of upholding your responsibility to protect. There is a right to seek asylum and to turn people away so that people are dying because boats are so unsafe and people are drowning. To have people language, but it's not just language, there's a policy of intentionally segregating the Rohingya community right now into IDP camps. You can say that's being done as a means of being able to better provide humanitarian assistance, but you can also look at it as an intentional segregation of the Rohingya population from the broader Burmese population. This conversation is not receiving anywhere near the level of attention that it should from within the international community. It's interesting that the OIC is beginning to talk more about it, and that you are getting certain Islamic countries raising the plight of the Rohingya in more international forums. But my sense is that it's just not sufficient. Even within the UN system, you can talk to certain UN actors, and I think there are some people in the UN here. But people actually use the term Bengali to refer to the Rohingya. And people may not realize that, but in the course of referring to someone as being Bengali, you're essentially affirming the government's portrayal of them as not being of Burma. The responsibility to protect is about protecting all populations within your own borders. It's not about protecting your own ethnic kind or your own even citizen. It's about populations. So I think the language responsibility protection should be used much more. I think one of the reasons it isn't is because many governments still have that experience of 2008 and trying to push this on the Security Council agenda in their mind, or because they feel, and there is a lot of sensitivities in Southeast Asia about questions of intervention. And when I use intervention, I don't mean military intervention, I mean any type of interference in the internal affairs of the state. So there's a sense of kind of deference to the way things are done there. But again, I think there's a lot more we can be doing, even with, the unraveling or kind of removal of economic sanctions. There still should be a strong conversation, and there has been by certain governments about benchmarks that need to be met before sanctions are removed. Granting citizenship, providing legal protection. I mean, Professor Provost talked about the legal obligations. If you want to take seriously the responsibility to protect, there are a couple of really basic things you can do, and they're not rocket science to try to identify. He talked about the basics. Botswana can actually ratify the Genocide Convention. But in many countries, when you look at the early warning signs of of mass atrocity crimes, there are clear legal norms that are related to those early warning signs. If you see segregation within education systems, if you see Rohingya children not being allowed to go to school with other children or going to school with Burman children, that's a clear problem. There's clear legal norms, international standards about segregation in education, segregation in access to healthcare, segregation in access to housing, the right to citizenship, protections for children under the Convention on the Rights of the Child about the right to identity. There are rights to family. The Rohingya, for example, do not even have the ability to control their own family planning, freedom of movement. All of these basic, what we consider to be kind of taken for granted legal rights, are things that do not exist for a particular community in Burma today. And if I was a government, I would very much take that into account. Thankfully I'm not, so I can say all this in a very lofty way. There is clear guidance and assistance that can be provided on what the legal infrastructure should look like to protect the basic rights of your citizens. And you can go back to the Holocaust to see how each of those rights were taken away from the Jews and how it made the Jewish population vulnerable. And I think that in this particular case, there's just a lot that needs to be done. I think we can all probably be doing much more. We've been working on the situation for a number of years and continue to. We're going to be releasing actually in a couple of weeks a policy brief actually on the Rohingya and on broader anti-Muslim violence, talking about it from the perspective of the responsibility to protect.
I just wanted to ask, so maybe is there a way to move R2P away from the UN? I mean, if you're talking multilateral approaches, you said that part of the problem with P5 that they failed to manage it in a multilateral way. I'm just wondering, the UN acts. There's a couple things I want to say that you bring back to what you said. If the UN is nations, states acting in their own interests, which they are, there's all these problems with the P5, the P3, the P2 that you've been calling. Is there a way to maybe have R2P work outside of the framework of the UN, even though it's part of the UN creation, in a way that would take some of the political drivers that we're currently facing, and if there is, what ways could NGOs and other players help to push this forward?
It's a great question. I mean, just to build on it, I think there's a distinction about moving it away from the UN Security Council, and then the kind of other UN political bodies like the General Assembly and Human Rights Council. Then there's also the UN as a kind of broader bureaucracy as a representative of the member states. I think that our goal is to move this conversation much more out of talking just about what the Security Council can do. We need to always have that on the table. The Security Council needs to be working to improve its basic working methods around these issues. But you're always going to be dealing with a very difficult political beast, but a political beast that actually has some teeth to it. So that's why it's kind of very useful. Also, bear in mind that in 138 and 139 of the World Summit Outcome document, if you do go to kind of the use of force and those coercive measures, it has to go through the Security Council. And that's a very important safeguard, and one that I think needs to be maintained. So, I'm not saying let's move it entirely out of, but as I've been saying, our focus should be much more on early prevention and early engagement. There's a lot more that broader governments can be doing. Within the General Assembly, over this past year, we've actually seen the General Assembly engage much more on country situations than they ever have before, and that's potentially quite promising. We've seen resolutions go through the General Assembly. What's been interesting is some of the voting records of these so-called emerging powers have actually differed between the votes they do in the General Assembly and the votes of the Security Council, which is really intriguing. We've also seen the Human Rights Council become much more active and robust in the steps that they've taken to uphold the responsibility to protect. And again, they may not say it's a responsibility to protect, but the actions suggest that they are behaving in a way that's conducive with the values. They have issued resolutions on individual country situations, Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, Syria, and a host of others. They have mandated commissions of inquiries in, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire and Syria. They've created new special procedures, kind of envoys, lots of different innovative tools that the Human Rights Council has begun to use. And those are spaces that are still very, very political, but have a broader group of states and a more diverse group of states than the Security Council. Then, of course, there's all the huge host of things that Claudia mentioned about kind of civil society and the way civil society can help work with governments. MIGS works with parliamentary groups, which is an amazing model. We work privately with governments on encouraging the creation of focal points and different architectures domestically. There are many forums where the conversation about R2P needs to happen. The same can be said for just within the broader UN bureaucracy. There is a conversation now about how to mainstream R2P. What mainstream means has yet to be kind of defined. But up until now, R2P has been a boutique issue. A boutique issue in that it's been primarily the purview of those based in New York who have debated and discussed it. It's been kind of the monopoly of the Security Council insofar as the actions that have been taken tend to get the most attention if they are taken by the Security Council, and we all talk about it because we talk so much about the use of force in the case of the Security Council. We need to broaden the conversation and broaden the forums where R2P is being advanced in order for this agenda to actually mean something going forward. I've been very kind of positive in my outlook. I'm cynical by nature, optimistic cynic. I don't know if that's possible. We have a very, very long way to go, but there are a lot of things that are very promising at this particular stage. And again, the fact that 30 governments are meeting in Ghana today, and it's not their New York representatives, it is their director of multilateral institutions, UN, all those types of things that are coming from capitals to talk about R2P is, I think, a very important and promising sign. The fact that you have ECOWAS and the EU and other regional organizations talking about R2P is a promising sign. So there is slowly the opening up of more forums where R2P will become vested, institutionalized, and begin to mean something. Maybe one or two last more questions if there are any. Yes?
My name is Ryan Higgins. I'm with the International Canada for Growth and Resilience. I thought your presentation was excellent, very insightful. If you can believe it, over the course of your talk, I was fixated on this can of Coca-Cola on the table. And sociologists and political scientists increasingly recognize the disparity between those who have and those who have not worldwide as very much a function or a consequence of the rise in the multinational corporation, or for that matter, the multinational financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO. To what extent are, if there's a crisis in the public sphere that's very much related to the rise in the multinational corporation, to what extent are they relevant to discussion about the prevention of mass atrocities?
Fascinating question. And we just happen to have someone whose organization is working on that particular question here and exploring the intersection between kind of public-private R2P and business interests. I highlighted the example of Kenya, where you had multinational corporations, Kenyan CEOs running multinational corporations, participating in meetings that they were holding in different parts of the country to talk about promoting peace and the role of business in promoting You had them speaking out, saying, you know, we need to be responsible stakeholders in this particular moment. You have a number of examples. I mean, there's been a lot of work done on extractive industries and the relationship between extractive industries and the perpetration of mass atrocities. And very... Yeah. Well, I mean, in Burma, there's actually now a lot of interest by multinational corporations and a lot of questions about what are the ethics associated with it. I don't have a lot to say other than I think it's a very important issue. I think that there are going to be a lot of interesting opportunities that will arise for people who are working on these particular issues. You've had kind of a real growth in kind of work that John Ruddy and others have done on creating this kind of compact for businesses about respecting human rights. And I think that, you know, we will increasingly potentially see that they do play an important role in trying to dissuade potential perpetrators, in trying to promote the creation of good governance structures. The reality is it's bad for the bottom line, quite honestly, to be in a very blunt manner, for there to be instability in a particular given country. And we've seen this kind of in discussions about the DRC in particular. One thing to just say, because you raised the kind of economic dimension, I've talked a lot about prevention, and I think it's worth flagging that prevention is not a sexy topic. In the wake of Kenya, I've had many people, diplomats, journalists, colleagues from within civil society say, oh gosh, the warnings were all wrong. You know, we basically overstated the problem. And you know, okay, we couldn't necessarily forecast that Ruto and Kenyatta would come together, or all the potential variables. But any Kenyan, for the most part, that you speak to, will say that there was a real risk of potential for political violence in the election. I have never seen such great traffic, and I've been going to Nairobi for about 10 years. There was during the election, because everyone was off the street. Shop owners basically said to me on multiple occasions, we'll open if there are no kills. I had my driver on multiple occasions tell me how great it was that people were disappearing, who were, you know, witnesses for the ICC, and by disappearing he meant being killed. You know, the environment was really quite intense. And to have people in the aftermath say, oh, please, the risks were overstated, you know, there was no need to be so captivated by prevention, I think shows the challenges that exist in trying to make an argument about why you should prioritize prevention. Prevention, for those of you who work at, approach from this more kind of development perspective, requires a financial investment at a period in which the economy around the world is facing a downturn. It's also one of the areas that gets hit. You know, you look at some of the good, I was born in Denmark, some of the good Scandinavian countries that invest a lot in international development assistance, they're cutting back. They're cutting back in exactly the types of areas that those of us who want to see RTP move forward desperately need investments. Good governance, rule of law, all these types of capacity building measures are being affected by the economic downturn. And we're also seeing a shift. We're seeing a rise of new emerging powers that are beginning to occupy the development space with a whole set of different priorities. And an important conversation needs to be had with your Brasilia, with the Brazilians and others, talking to them about the importance of prevention, approaching it from the perspective of, you know, addressing poverty alleviation, but also talking about creating laws to ensure that people have access to education in a non-segregated manner, that people have the right to vote, go hand in hand, and that these new emerging powers, with their development funding and with their political clout that will increasingly probably grow, have their kind of interests and eyes attuned to the need to prioritize prevention. Because in the absence, in this particular moment, with a topic that's not sexy, with something that's sometimes hard to make the argument for, in a climate of economic decline, prevention is one of the easiest things to just quickly scrap out, because you don't win a lot of elections saying, I help prevent mass atrocities in X country. So, I've got 2 minutes, so if anyone has a parting question, burning desire. No? Okay. Yes? Oh, go for it.
No, it's interesting. Remember last June, we met in Geneva for a special session at the Human Rights Council on Human Rights Council. And there was a representative from Cuba who stood up and spoke for 7 governments: Russia, Venezuela, Sri Lanka, Sudan, China, and one other. Namibia. So they oppose RTP as a colonial construct. And someone turned to me and I asked them, this diplomat, and said, actually, it's not that. 6 months ago, it was 25 that were against it. So I'm wondering, in the past year, if you've seen this group of countries that actually are shrinking in the face of what's happening in Syria, and in cases where you see large numbers of people dying, whether they're changing their views, and they have trouble kind of maintaining that same position in the international community.
Great question. Look, if I saw that same Russian diplomat today, do I think he would say the exact same thing as he said in Sri Lanka? Yes, I do. When I speak with Venezuelan diplomats, has their position changed at all in the last 6 years? No. What has changed is that they pretty much now are the only ones speaking out. And what has changed is that their neighbors are increasingly standing up. And I watched this happen 2 weeks ago at a private meeting and basically said, you're a load of shit, essentially, excuse my language. In very diplomatic terms, they said, that was not diplomatic, they were diplomatic. They were diplomatic, and I didn't say who it was. But basically said, you come from a region that has experienced the negative consequences of intervention. You also come from a region that has led in many ways in trying to advance the mass atrocity prevention agenda. If you look at Latin America, you take a country like Argentina, for example. So many of the international standards that we have about enforced disappearances, which is one of the crimes under crimes against humanity, they exist because the Argentinas and the Uruguays and the Latin American countries came together to develop one of the most rigorous human rights systems in the world. The inter-American system is incredibly, it faces lots of challenges and threats. Legally, the norms that exist there are incredibly strong. To have a country that has experienced mass atrocities stand up and say to Venezuela and Nicaragua and others, like, let's move on. We're tired of this. It's predictable. I think is really important, and that did not happen 6 years ago. And it did not happen even a year ago. And I think that one of the things that has contributed to that, at least in the Latin American context, and I highlight Latin America because while Russia and China continue to oppose in many ways R2P, in practice, they don't mount a robust opposition to it in any international forum. But the Venezuelans and Nicaraguas still do. And what I think has changed in terms of some of the countries that did have reservations and do have skepticism, which there's quite a few, is that Brazil stepped into the conversation in 2011. 2012, really, but began in 2011 in the wake of Libya. And Brazil basically introduced an idea called responsibility while protecting. And responsibility while protecting essentially calls for, I'm going to really simplify this in a very unfair way probably, calls for more accountability and transparency in the implementation of Security Council use of force mandates, which means more clear and open reporting. So for example, Brazilians and other countries were very unhappy with the fact that the French violated the kind of arms embargo that existed in Libya. And then in their reporting, this goes back to that question about, why I feel a little bit tense around the kind of P5 question, the working methods and the relationship with elected members. Reportedly, the French reporting was something along the lines of like one paragraph. We violated the arms embargo. So there's a lot of working methods issues that came out in this Brazilian concept. But the Brazilians were essentially saying that, you need to use the use of force as the absolute last course of action. We need to be aware of the fact that there are very negative consequences, potentially, that may be the outcomes of military intervention taken to save lives. And we saw, even in the course of Brazil introducing this idea of responsibility while protecting, a shift in the Brazilian position from a point in which they started where I think they were actually quite hostile to R2P. They had statements like, one life lost is one life too many. Well, if that's the case, then you probably can never undertake a military intervention. To the point where they were much more ready to acknowledge that you need to be able to use all three pillars. Why it's significant and why I even raise the Brazilians is because Brazil's important. I'm cautious about kind of overstating the importance of emerging powers, but the reality is Brazil is a country that experienced dictatorship where mass atrocities were perpetrated. Tens of thousands of people were put into detention and tortured. You know, it's unclear how many people actually died during that course, maybe around 500 people. The president herself is a victim of torture. Many of her senior officials were the victims of gross human rights violations themselves during the dictatorship. For them to speak out with a history of mass atrocities, with a history of Western interference, with a strong legalist, non-interventionist background, for them to start talking about something as sensitive as sovereignty and redefining what sovereignty means, and to talk about the importance of human rights, like taking military action to prevent mass atrocities, was really significant. And it created a space where other countries that were concerned about the way the mandate in Libya was implemented could actually speak. They could use RWP, which at a baseline said support R2P, and raise concerns about how the mandate was implemented, but all the while saying we accept that R2P is important. And I think that it was Brazil engaging that, thank you very much, Brazil engaging that did help make it more difficult for the Venezuelans of the world to be as outspoken. And I have to underscore, they can be outspoken, but name one norm where in practice you don't have at least a couple outliers who are opposing it. I don't think you're going to find it. You know, we all agree that there's a prohibition on torture. I worked in Canada on the case of Canadian men tortured in Syria and Egypt at the behest of our government based on information gathered by our government. And the prohibition on torture is something that is kind of one of the oldest values that we all embrace. So I only say that to kind of underscore that you will always have dissenting voices. We are seeing a shift in practice, and we're seeing a broadening of the governments that are being engaged and involved in this particular conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. We could have gone longer. It really pained me to hold up a sign that said 0 minutes. Nice way to say it, we have to cut it now. So everyone, we're going to actually just have a short coffee break, and then we're going to turn in about 10 to 12 minutes to a presentation on the role of journalists in the Prevention of Genocide with Dr. Alan Thompson. Thank you very much.